Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, hello, Regis Kelvin is the name, and Heroes of the Storm is the game. And this is my first look at Zool. Now, that said, this is a much belated first look at Zool, and I've actually almost already got the hero to level 10. But in the interest of continuity and consistency, I wanted to do a first impressions video of Zool where we take a look at his basic abilities, his talents, just some general overall thoughts on his strategy. And since I've played the hero quite a bit, I'm actually well equipped to do this time around. So, if you're not familiar with Zool, he is a specialist by designation, but really plays almost like a melee assassin in a sense, who's also capable of lots of utility for your team, as well as the ability to push lanes incredibly well thanks to his trait called Raise Skeleton. When a nearby enemy minion dies, it becomes a skeletal warrior that attacks for some damage and lasts up to 15 seconds, and you get 4 of those warriors at any given time. And when one dies, a new one spawns. There's no cooldown on Raised Skeleton charges, so you can just pop out skeletons constantly as long as they're either being killed or being timed out. And this makes him really good at clearing minion waves because as you kill the first minion, you get another minion to attack, essentially giving your minion wave a huge advantage. As you'll see when we kill some of these waves, some skeletons will spawn up, and those become a nuisance and march down the lane alongside your minions, eating tower shots and doing damage as well, giving you a pretty big advantage when it comes to pushing lanes. So Zool's good at that, but he also has a lot of stuff in his kit that just makes him good as a team fight assassin type hero as well. So let's go ahead and take a look at Zool's basic ability, starting with his Q, Spectral Scythe. This 60 mana spell has a 8-second cooldown. It summons a scythe that travels to you after 1 second, dealing 526 damage to enemies. So this is kind of a reverse skill shot, whereas most skill shots would move from your hero outwards. This one starts outwards and actually moves to your hero. So it's a little bit harder to aim. One thing that you have to keep in mind is that there is a significant delay between it casting. It has a little wind-up time. So you have to lead your shots a little bit if you want to hit them at the end. You can also move after you've casted it to change the direction and path. You'll notice I had a little bit of an arc there in the travel path of the scythe. So it takes a little bit to get used to, but it does massive amounts of damage. And the area of effect circle on it's actually pretty big, so you can hit a lot of stuff, including a full minion wave. So the utility on that is very high. Moving on to his W, Curse Strike, 65 mana, 15-second cooldown. Your basic attacks deal damage in a wide area. You can see the area there is absolutely enormous, like just totally absurd how many people get hit by this. And they reduce the attack speed of enemies by 40% for 2 seconds. This Curse Strike lasts for 4 seconds once you attack for the first time. So you can activate it, but the 4-second timer has not actually gone off yet. Until I attack something, we won't see that go off. And I'll attack these guys over here just to show you the range. You'll note that now I'm hitting all 4 of the minions at once. So not only does that allow you to hit minion waves very well, but in team fights you'll also catch 2 or 3 heroes oftentimes in one big swath of your attacks there. And the nice thing is it's not just allowing you to do AoE damage, which is very good. It's also reducing the attack speed of enemies by 40%. So it's a great counter to any heroes that benefit from auto attacks, say like a Butcher who's healing with Butcher's Brand. You're slowing his attack so he's healing less often and for less. Same with like Charism, he won't heal for as much. And also you're just reducing damage from somebody like a Rainer or a Thrall who relies on auto attacks to pump out a ton of damage. So the utility here is not just big AoE damage, but it's also hampering and debuffing the enemy team as well. And then up next for Zool is his E ability, Bone Prison. This one's a little bit expensive when it comes to mana. It does cost 80 mana. Also has a slightly longer cooldown at 12 seconds. After a 2-second delay, you deal 175 damage to the target, and it roots that target for 2 seconds. Now this can only be used on enemy heroes. We'll see it in action here on the target dummy. After a little delay, a prison will spring up, and they will be unable to move while that prison is active. It also does a very small amount of damage. But this ability is huge for isolating targets in the enemy team and securing kills and really just guiding your teammates towards the right target. Whenever this hits, they know exactly who to hit, and they know that that person won't be able to get away unless they have some sort of unstoppable effect or a cleanse. So it's very good at guiding and directing teammates, as well as allow you to finish kills off as well. So you can for sure hit your W, for instance, land your sights a little easier. for dueling scenarios as well. And E is really, I think, the defining ability in Zul's kit and makes him incredibly strong in disorganized team comps because it helps you become organized. It's also really good at pretty much any echelon of play. Pros like it as well because it just forces a reaction and a response. But in disorganized comps, it shines especially well. Zul actually has one other basic ability in his kit. He has a 1 ability called Bone Armor with a 30-second cooldown. You activate this to gain a shield. You'll see the shield pop up there. That's equal to 25% of your maximum health for 3 seconds. So that gives you some extra survivability. As a melee assassin, well, you're not actually an assassin, but as a melee attacker, you do need that survivability to get into the enemy team, pop that shield at key moments, setting up bone prisons because it does have a pretty short range, as well as your W as well, because you need to get in there and be able to hit multiple people. So your bone armor allows you to do that. So let's go ahead and move on to the Zul talents and talk about what's good and what's not, and just go through each of them in a little bit of detail. Starting off with level 1, all 3 of these talents actually affect your bone armor active talent here, your extra ability. Starting with Backlash, when bone armor expires, nearby heroes take damage equal to 15% of their maximum health. So this has that 3-second timer. When that 3-second timer is off and your shield is gone, you basically explode for insanely huge damage. 15% is a monster amount, particularly against tanks. And Backlash is not really the most popular of these talents. That would go to Shade, but it's marginally popular and extremely good, particularly if the enemy team has multiple tanks that you can lock down with your E. Because if you time your Bone Prison in conjunction with your shield correctly, you can pretty reliably hit this Backlash. It takes a little bit of practice to get used to, but once you start landing it and understand how to land it, you'll be surprised how often this actually goes off for big damage. So in certain compositions, Backlash does make sense, particularly if the enemy team has a lot of high health heroes. For instance, like a Cho'Gall can really chunk a Cho'Gall where you otherwise wouldn't be able to do that so much. Moving on to Shackler, while Bone Armor is active, you slow nearby enemies by 30% for 1 second. This one, I kind of like it, but it doesn't get much traction. It doesn't see a lot of play. It just offers less utility than the other two, despite being a pretty interesting and neat effect itself. It's kind of like Arthas's E ability with a big circle around him as well that slows enemies. This one doesn't do damage, but that slow is still significant because you do need to stick to targets with Zul, especially to land that big E in those key moments. But Shade is actually the most popular and I think undisputably the best of all these. While your Bone Armor is active, you evade all basic attacks, but you do increase the cooldown of Bone Armor by 10 seconds. So first, the cooldown increase is really not that big of a deal. Usually you only get to use it once per big engagement anyway, and big engagements aren't happening so often that your Bone Armor feels like it's down all the time just because of that extra 10 seconds. So the difference between 30 and 40 seconds is somewhat marginal. But the evasion that this provides is insane. Not only do you have your W to counter auto attacks, but this also means you're just evading auto attacks. So when that Butcher locks into you and starts to cast Butcher's Brand and he's going to whack at you for heals, if you pop your Shade, not only do you get a shield that reduces all that extra damage, but Butcher's going to miss every attack for that 3-second period. So he won't be able to heal at all off of his Butcher's Brand, essentially. So timing evasion in those key moments can make a big impact. Plus, it just gives you extra survivability on top of the shield that you're already getting from Bone Armor, which makes Shade just insanely good. Moving on to the level 4 talent, starting off with Death's Reach, increases Spectral Scythe range by 20%. So you'll note the range on this is not too bad, but it's a little short sometimes. You do feel like if it was a little longer, you'd be happier. So let's take that. You can see this is significantly different. The problem is it does make it a little bit harder to aim in the sense you have to adjust for the cooldown and they're farther away when you're trying to hit a target. So it can cause some issues with aiming and actually hitting the skill shot, but the range is nice. And I'll say that with Zul right now, there are kind of 2 different paths that you can branch out to, or at least 2 prominent paths. One is a Spectral Scythe build, and the other is really a Raise Skeletons kind of build. So keep that in mind. Death's Reach certainly fits into the Spectral Scythe build, but probably isn't worth it unless you go into other Spectral Scythe talents at level 13, level 16, and perhaps even level 20. But it's still awfully good. Moving on to Jailers. Bone Prison spawns 2 skeletal warriors that fixate on the enemy for 15 seconds. These do not count towards your raised skeleton maximum. So Jailers is an incredibly strong talent. Whenever you pop that E on somebody, it's going to go ahead and spawn 2 skeletons on them, which do hit for a surprising amount of damage and can cause essentially a little bit of an annoyance. So you'll see the little skellies there. And they fixate for the full 15 seconds that they are alive, the same as normal skeletons. So in team fights, they do give you a little bit of extra bodies in the team fight and can just be annoying dudes that chase people around forever. Plus extra damage on your E-target is always nice because that E-target is the one you usually want to burn down as quickly as possible, so that allows you to do that. And Jailers is really the most popular talent on this tier for good reason. It's just nice extra damage exactly when you need it. There's also Trag'Ul's Essence. Gain 8 mana when you raise a skeletal warrior. There is a raised skeleton build, and in fact we'll pick some raised skeleton talents later on, but this one doesn't really go with them. Zul's not that mana starved, and you shouldn't run into too many issues with mana, and the payback on this one's just not enough to make it worth it, particularly when Jailers is so good. So Jailers is actually really the fundamental piece of the raised skeleton branch, as opposed to the Scythe branch of Zul's talents at level 4. Moving on to level 7, starting off with Harvest Vitality. Curse Strikes heals you for 145 for each hero hit, so that is our W, of course. And that means anyone that's in that range of your W is going to heal you for 145 each time you hit them. So there are like 5 people in that, for instance. You can heal for some massive amounts. And that makes Harvest Vitality good. Maybe if they have a very melee-heavy team that's going to clump together and all be close by, and you know you're going to have multiple targets. But otherwise, the healing here is a little bit unreliable and not high impact enough, particularly against a single target. Up next is Weaken. Increases Curse Strike's attack speed slow from 40% to 75%. That's a huge deal. That's a really nice slow, but again, the impact here is kind of marginal. You're already making a big play with Curse Strikes in the first place, and that difference, while significant, is not enough necessarily to swing fights all on its own. Plus, it's just hard to hit all the targets you want all the time with Weakens. So you kind of get diminishing returns on this one. If you're only hitting 1 or 2 people and maybe not the Rainer in the back line, the payback here is minimal, particularly because a lot of times you'll be catching like a tank and 1 assassin. And the tank's damage is probably not meaningful or significant, and usually isn't beneficial from side effects like a Butcher's Brand, or for instance, or a Charism heal. There's also Rathma's Blessing. This anytime you raise a skeletal warrior, it actually heals you for 145. So that means, remember, you can have 4 up at once from a minion wave, so that minion wave is going to heal you for almost 600 damage, right? 580 health, I guess, each wave. And you have 400, so it only takes a couple waves to really start bumping your health back up. I actually like Rathma's Blessing the best. It's not necessarily the team fight choice, because there isn't often a minion wave right in the middle of a team fight, but it is the early to mid-game sustain choice that allows you to kind of venture off on your own, clear some waves, pressure a lane, jump into a team fight at full health, reduce pressure on your support, and it keeps you in the action for longer, and make sure you're just always topped off and ready to go and constantly pressuring lanes. So I like that one. If you're in a super team fight comp, Harvest Vitality is going to provide you more healing when it counts, particularly if you're getting focused down. But otherwise, Rathma's Blessing is more general utility. I would say this is probably the Scythe angle, and this is the Raised Skeleton angle. Both of these see play. I think Rathma's Blessing still sees more play, though. And now for heroics, we're going to start with Poison Nova. This 90-second cooldown heroic is huge damage. After a short delay, you release poisonous missiles that deal 1,250 damage to all enemies hit over 10 seconds. So you'll see this go off. There's a small channel there, which means this can be interrupted. And then after that, a huge swarm of little green balls will go out and hit as many enemies as you can. Now note, those are dodgeable, particularly the farther away they are. They're kind of easy to slalom between or step between. But if you get people up close, you're usually going to hit 3 or 4 targets pretty reliably in the middle of a team fight. particularly in the Chaos. So Poison Nova is the most popular heroic. It's very good. It does lots of damage. It's annoying for people. It puts a lot of pressure on healers and can swing team fights. That said, I don't like it as well as the other alternative. And despite this being picked 60 to 70% of the time, it does actually have a lower win rate in Hero League than does Skeletal Mages. So I like Skeletal Mages better, and I see some data to support the fact that it might in fact be the better heroic overall. With Skeletal Mages, it has a slightly shorter cooldown at 70 seconds instead of 90. It summons 4 Frost Mages in a line that attack nearby enemies for 103 damage per second, and actually applies a 30% slow as well. And these guys last for 15 seconds, much like your normal skeletons do. So you'll see this here. These guys basically attack anything that jumps in range of them, and also apply a slow. You'll see them burning through the target dummy there, and you'll note that when there's only one target, all 4 of them are hitting for basically 400 DPS all on their own. And that's why Skeletal Mages can be good in a dueling scenario. If you need to finish off a kill, if somebody's trying to flee, you can drop this. It'll start hitting them, apply a slow, allow you to catch them, hit them with a root, hit them with a scythe, so on and so forth. But it's also really good in team fights to drop it on the enemy's back line. So it's hitting that Lieutenant Morales, it's hitting that Vala, it's hitting that Rainer, all those squishy heroes, because it's very annoying for them to deal with. They can turn to attack it, they can move away, they can just sit and bear the damage, which is really nice because it's free chip damage that's pretty significant after 5 or 10 seconds. You can also use it to basically split up enemy teams, the tanks and melee guys up here and the ranged folks back here, and they might move away to get to safety. The tanks might be isolated, so there's some zoning plays. You can also just use it to cover escapes. The enemies are fleeing from here and you want to block their path, you can just drop it here. They either have to choose to take damage, maybe stay and fight, they get slowed no matter what. There's just a lot of different ways to use Skeletal Mages, and I think a smart player who understands their impact can get more value out of them than Poison Nova. But not everybody agrees, so test them both and see what you like. Let's go ahead and move on to level 13. Decrepify. Spectral Scythe slows enemies by 40% for 3 seconds. So slows are good in Zul's kit because it allows him to get in range to do stuff with his Curse Strikes and his Bone Prison and all that's very nice. And there's, like I said, a moderately popular Spectral Scythe build that really focuses on that aspect of Zul's kit, and Decrepify fits into it very nicely. There's also Giant's Cursed. Curse Strikes deals an additional 2% of maximum health as damage to heroes. So this is really Giant Killer for Zul. But you'll note that since Curse Strikes can hit multiple people, you can really get extra value of this. Like I said, if they have 2 tanks or 3 melee heroes that are right up in front and taking your Curse Strikes right to the face, this will allow you to hit them for pretty significant extra damage. So this isn't seen all the time, but it has some distinct applications in certain team compositions against certain heroes. There's also, at level 13, Corpse Explosion. When Skeletal Warriors die, they explode for 121 damage in a small area, and that deals 100% increased damage to non-heroic enemies. So Corpse Explosion, of course, is right alongside the skeleton build, essentially. This gives them a little bit extra damage right at the end of their lifespan and makes them even better at pushing non-heroic enemies, of course, being minions and so on. So very good for split pushing, and although not huge and high impact in team fights, still a very reliable build that seems to be providing the highest win rates for Zul. So I still like to stick by Corpse Explosion. You'll note also that your jailers, level 4 jailers spawn skeletal warriors. When those die, they're also going to explode. So this does add a little bit of small utility in team fights as well. Moving on to level 16, starting with Executioner. Standard Executioner basic attacks deal 40% more damage against slowed, rooted, or stunned targets. This has some pretty interesting implications with Zul because he does have so many different ways to slow and root. With his ult and with E, of course, and other heroes on his team as well are going to have crowd control. So you might get a lot of value out of Executioner. It's not necessarily a go-to choice, but in certain situations and contexts, it's very valuable. There's also Flowing Wounds. The Spectral Scythe option reduces Spectral Scythe's cooldown by 4 seconds if you hit an enemy hero. You'll note that the cooldown is 8 seconds, so this cuts it in half. And given all the travel time and all the other stuff factoring into Spectral Scythe, it really does feel like you can kind of machine gun Spectral Scythes at some point, firing them off basically every 3 seconds, or at least having them hit every 3-4 seconds, which is very nice, as long as you're able to hit skill shots. Otherwise, this will lose value very rapidly. There's also Amplified Damage, which I think is far and away the strongest talent in this tier. Enemies rooted by Bone Prison become vulnerable for 2 seconds, taking 25% increased damage. As I mentioned before, that Bone Prison is really a signal for your team to jump and dump on enemies caught within it, and this makes it even easier to kill them. It's also just great for dueling scenarios. If you catch somebody in a lane and you want to try to kill them, Amplified Damage is going to allow you to burn through them even more quickly. And then finally, Skeleton Mastery. Increase the maximum skeletal warriors you can have to 6 and increase their damage by 50%. This, of course, is the final piece of the Raised Skeletons build. I really still like this talent. It just makes Zool so devastating when he swings by a lane and kills a few minions. Your skeletons will basically be going off all the time. When you've got 6, it's even better. And in the late game, it just makes you an absolute force. Even when you stop by a lane for just a few seconds, you're spawning 6 skeletons that are going to push for 16 seconds. It just makes you so scary and hard to deal with. So if your game is skewing away from team fights and more towards map control, Skeleton Mastery can give you an advantage, particularly in combination with these other skeleton talents. But if it's all team fight based, depending if you're Spectral build or you're just a general kind of hodgepodge build, Amplified Damage or Executioner might offer some value. And then finally at level 20, starting off with Call of the Grave, the upgrade to Poison Nova. This deals an additional 1% of the target's maximum life as damage every second. You'll note that this is a 10-second effect, so that means you're going to be doing an extra 10% damage to the target. I don't really like that much. 10%'s nothing to scoff at, but remember, like, our backlash does 15% itself, so is that better than a level 20 upgrade? Yeah, perhaps it is. It makes it a little bit harder for healers to heal through, but still they can survive it and recover. So Call of the Grave is too slow of an impact to really matter. There's also Raised Mage. When a nearby enemy hero dies, a Frost Mage appears from their corpse to fight for you. It also increases the slow of Frost Mages from 30% to 50%. So this is your upgrade to Skeletal Mages. And despite it being an unpopular choice, I think it might be the strongest talent at this tier. It definitely has one of the highest win rates, so the data supports that as well. The increased slow is substantial. 30% to 50% is markedly different, and it's markedly better. Also, you'll be surprised how often that Frost Mage springs up in the middle of a team fight when you get like one pick, and it can make a pretty significant difference because it's going to be applying that slow, it's going to be doing extra damage, especially against like a Murky comp or Lost Vikings. Anytime you're going to get really cheap free kills, Raised Mage gets even better, but I think it's good anyway, so definitely give Raised Mage a try. I think you might like it. There's also Mortal Wound. Enemies hit by Spectral Scythe receive 75% less healing for 4 seconds. This is actually a crazy talent, and nothing else like it exists in the game. You can basically totally cut out the enemy team's ability to heal if you're able to hit your Qs on time and on target, and this would be the final piece of the Spectral Scythe build, of course. So you can essentially do this every 4 seconds, and it lasts for 4 seconds. So if you hit your shots and you're able to survive and land it on the right target, this means you can reduce their healing permanently for 75 seconds, as long as you're able to keep casting your Q and keep hitting them, right? So it's really good for securing kills and burning through targets and reducing things like Rhaegar's Ancestral Healing or just any healing in general, like Lieutenant Morales' Beam, for instance. That said, I think it's much better in a professional setting where organized teams can coordinate on a target and know what's happening and play for it. And disorganized, like here are your quick match compositions. Even though this raw effect is super powerful, it's so hard to time and make it work that it's just really not good for anything but pro players on a highly competitive level. And then finally, Bone Spear, 10-second cooldown, active ability at your 2. It's really just a Jaina Frostbolt that's a little easier to hit, that does 570 damage to anyone in it, and it does, as you'll see with this approaching minion wave, it does hit everything in a line, so it pierces targets, meaning it's incredibly good at team fights because you'll hit 1 or 2 people on it, sometimes 3 or 4. It's great for hitting minions as well. This is actually the go-to talent choice for most people at level 20 that's going to give you the best results and allow you to do extra damage and just influence fights and minion waves more immediately than would Raised Mage. But Raised Mage is kind of a pet pick for me, so feel free to try that out too. But you can't go wrong with Bone Spear. It does everything you need to do as Zool and makes you even better at getting kills. And that short 10-second cooldown really means you've got 5 basic abilities now, all of which are incredibly good and highly impactful. So that's it. That's my first look at Zool. Really a little late. It's a level 10 look at Zool almost, but hopefully you understand his basic abilities and his talents and know how to play him a little better. So thanks so much for watching, and until next time, game on.